So since we started with an opening of community, if you want to be in community with me, these are some of the ways to find me in the digital world. My website, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, they are listed in the order of my energy investment and where I have game. Obviously, I have more game in Facebook than Instagram. I'm still learning Instagram, but you can play with me anywhere you like. And if you are on Facebook, we do have a group called Qualitative Research in Education, and I built up the group to the with the understanding that we're going to challenge traditional perspectives in qualitative research to make space for critical and decolonial perspectives. All right. So we did our centering. That was one of the things we were going to do, so we did. So let me tell you a little bit about my journey, because in all things, I want to situate myself. And, and in my introduction, some of that was already mapped, but I want to tell you how that shaped the way I have been thinking about colonialism, decoloniality, and the research that I do. So I was born in India, and I left India during my early teenage years. And then I came to Canada, and I did my high school and undergraduate from Canada. And then I came to US to do my graduate work. And then since then I have been in the US, and now I am an academic in University of Florida. But in this sort of, you know, these decades of border crossings, physical border crossings, there were emotional, psychological, spiritual border crossings that have also happened, because it has been a developmental journey. All of our journeys are developmental. So it has been a developmental journey. And as a result of it has been a developmental journey, um, it creates a feeling of I am from here and not from here simultaneously. And you become an outsider to where you are, and you become an outsider to where you came from. So you are simultaneously insider, outsider to multiple communities, and so that creates a sense of shuttling. And so you move back and forth. So partly what in the introduction, what Fatma Kanu said, that if you have this Nepantleric journey, then you are this sort of polyglot, this traveler who moves in and out of multiple worlds and crosses their thresholds, but doesn't get indoctrinated in it so much that they remain in one world. And I've kind of led that life where I am in and out of multiple worlds. Initially, it was for survival that I figured out how to be multilingual, multi-epistemological, multi-ontological in these spaces. And now, through this shuttling, there's a sense of liminality in which I exist and sort out my stuff. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep our conversation as sort of conversational, but I recently published an encyclopedic entry for decolonizing educational research, and I sort of took a much more global perspective on it. So I'm going to do some readings from that piece, just because it's my most current thought on decolonizing educational research. So it's sort of my shuttling, my border crossing that I'm going to give you a glimpse of, and then we can go into deeper conversation about it. So what I want to talk about when I talk about this D/colonizing is that I'm going to talk about what happens to once colonized folks and also the settler colonized folks. Since the world has a huge history of colonization from multiple different cultures and has a settler colonized history and an existence in current moments in many nations, I wanted to bring both of them together when we talk about T/colonizing, only because if we don't, then there's a giant part of history we would be erasing. And I just want to be more inclusive when we have that conversation. So uh, I'm not sure if I'm saying this name right, so apologies in advance. I think it's Ndlovu Gatsheni. He posits that through their territorialization in India, East Africa, and Southern Africa, colonial ideologies were formed to control and enslave the natives. And then if you're paying attention, you know that the minute you do that, the natives are always in relationship to the colonizer. And so Mahmoud Mamdani explains that the native is not to be understood as original or authentic, but as a byproduct of the colonial state, and thereby synonymous with being colonized. And so that goes with any of these forces of oppression that folks face. You're minoritized, you're not a minority, you're marginalized, you're not living in a, you're not somebody off margins, you are being marginalized. There are forces that put you in those locations. Um, so then let me there. And so then colonized native, this binary relationship marks a reductive state of being. Like, so you're reduced into this relationship, you're reduced into this binary, and then enough oppressive forces that sort of doled out to you that a lot of your energy is just in managing and mitigating this oppressive force and this binary, that a lot of us have a primary part of our identity formed by this. And this is a very reductive way of being. It zaps our energy, it zaps our spirit, it zaps our joy. But it feels like it's for survival that we have to be in this sort of very spirit draining, oppressive binary relationship. So then on the other hand, this reduction also casts other binary relationships, who's civilized and who's uncivilized. Our customs are seen as uncivilized, but they're simultaneously castigated and co-opted, repackaged, and commodified with limited access for the native colonized to their own customs. So if you just look at the world, the yoga industry is $1 billion industry at the moment, but just type yoga and do a Google image search, you'll see a white woman in some scenic beach location, doing this. And you go to like any yoga studio or any kind of yoga company or anything, and you'll see who's in charge of these things and how much money they charge for you to be able to do this. And not just to go to your yoga studio, you got to buy the outfits and you got to buy accessories, and all of this has this gatekeeping from the very folks that they have co-opted all of this from. Now you also have goat yoga and 1990s yoga, boobies and booties yoga. After a while, it's just all absurd to me. I don't even know how to process it anymore. I just look at it and go, okay, all right, I'm in an absurd world, and I'll come back to this absurdity as we talk. So this was something I wrote in the piece that I was talking about, the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Education in Cambridge. And it doesn't escape me that I'm writing all of this for a publication in the country whose history has all sorts of brutal colonizing narratives connected to my people. And that's part of the reason I accepted it, because I wanted to insert myself into that space and be an expert voice in that space. So this native colonized binary, should be seen as something that is much more blurred than native, and removing the rigidly fixed categorization of the native that is cast via the colonizer's imagination as backwards, custom focused, inhabiting a separate world from the colonizer, and adhering to a stationary form of tribalism in contrast to the progressive colonizers. So that's why I slash my decolonizing, and I'll explain that a lot more. So slashing decolonizing critiques the binary relationship that reifies the native as a political subject of the colonizer, because it's always in this hierarchical relationship. So I'm slashing it. So conceptualizing D/colonizing as fluid. So there is no one set of relationship as fluid dispels the illusion that the colonized existed in a stationary condition until the colonizers introduced a novel construct of progressiveness. And that is to really challenge the notion of Western superiority, as if like everything was in its inferior dark ages until the colonized came and civilized us. And so that's why I want to keep it in this. And in modern days, it's very hard to draw those binaries between colonized and native, especially in once colonized nation states as well, because in those states we often discipline each other in the colonizers' ways, and we don't know like how exactly to think native, or that thinking native is essentially free from other forms of oppression. So is it, if you think native, is it free from homophobia? Is it free from transphobia? Is it free from ableism? So Islamophobia, is it free from all of these things? And so this romanticization of native as something that we want, this utopia, is also problematic. So I wanted to slash the D/colonizing to keep things in fluidity, because it felt that there isn't a pure space that is purely colonized, there's terrain, and there isn't a pure space that is purely the natives terrain. Then these things are forever in fluid relationship, and definitely should not be only seen through how it's cast from the colonizer's perspective. So here, Mamdani's work had been very useful for me to think through this from a different lens than the work that gets circulated from the global north. So I kind of shared this with you because they're so powerful. That's why I'm sharing the excerpts with you, because it really helped me think through this in a way that I don't always think with some of the scholars that speak to the more land arguments connected to settler colonialism. So Mamdani explains that a census was taken by the British colonizers to label those who migrated to African colonies as a race, and those whom the colonizers deemed indigenous to the land as a tribe. So now you can see that means like the colonizers have come and said this group of people should be called race, this group of people are tribes. And this often set up in competing relationships for resources and for legal, educational, and social rights. So what happens is that if you said that and you said these things are for people who are this race, and these are for people who are from tribes, and then you have resources differentially distributed, legal rights differentially distributed. So this separation centered geography and erased the history of migration, thereby erasing cultural histories and built-in reciprocities between the people that were there before the British started creating this sort of stratus. Such separation pinned groups of people fighting against each other instead of resisting the colonizers. So then it gets people thinking that this is a deficit narrative. There's only limited resources, and we now have to fight each other to get those resources, to get access to those opportunities. Or more aptly, this move positioned geography in opposition to the history of the land, so that the division between racial and tribal people and its associated privileges through colonial governance with differing rights to land, property, education, justice would mitigate D/colonial resistances formed in solidarity. And then this reduces down to the divide and conquer colonial mentality that you see across practically any kind of colonial history, settler colonialism, that there's always this sort of let's break these people up. Let's create differential opportunities in how we break them up. Let's then get them to stay mad at somebody else who has extra opportunities, and then let them be so drained in that fight that they forget that we're the ones who are creating this sort of deficit when they could easily have access to the abundance, because the abundance is there. But we are so entrapped in this oppressor-oppressed relationship, and all our energies are trapped because we want to do justice to our existence, but we forget that we exist in other relationship other than this one binary that has become a dominant narrative to people like me who come from a once colonized nation and are in settler colonial states. So this is sort of like my worldview on de/colonizing, that it's not just land issue. Land is definitely an issue, and it's issue for any kind of settler colonial history, but it's also that there is no pre-colonial utopia, as I said, and that there is a lot to be learned about de/colonizing from global south, from east. And so I want to have more knowledge flow going in multi-directional way instead of like north to south or west to east. And different scholars, various scholars, Glorian Zaldua, Chandratal Padmuhanti, Franz Fanon, Linda Tuyai Smith, they have all critiqued this sort of superiority of Western knowledge construction. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on, but this Western knowledge construction creates this superiority that everything was unknown, uncivilized, uneducated, unenlightened until Western civilization. But we know from the world's history is that civilization existed before, the Enlightenment era. And so those things get erased if we think that our knowledge, our benchmarking of research, of inquiry, of philosophy, of science, all of it starts with Western civilization, then there is a huge erasure. Linda Tuyai Smith talks about research being a dirty word, just because she's a Maori indigenous scholar in New Zealand. And obviously anybody who does decolonizing work is familiar with her. If you're not, or you're new to this space, I will heavily encourage you to read her book called Decolonizing Methodologies. It was a book that I picked up in graduate schools, and it deeply transformed the way I thought. And the path that I'm on today started with that book. So I want to acknowledge her as my academic elder, and say that you should go and take a look at that book, because we have this sort of history of how, in the name of research, various communities, Black communities, Indigenous communities, my own, have been disenfranchised through a lot of dehumanizing, brutal engagement. And with the Indigenous communities in New Zealand, they had scalped Indigenous peoples' skull and put millet seeds in it, and to see how much they can occupy, and then use that as if it's a scientific reason to say that those folks were less than human and therefore deserving of subhuman treatment. And that's not limited to Indigenous folks. You would see that this sort of treatment has been in other communities as well. Tuskegee Project is another one where folks have been treated very poorly in the name of research, and there are other examples as well. So when I think of de/colonizing, I think of colonizing structures interconnected with other structures of oppression. So when the colonizer comes and enacts violence, they create disabilities in people. When settler colonial nation states, like in US, ignores, Flint, Michigan's water quality, it creates diseases amongst people. And so these structures, although they're slightly different in its aim, they're interlocked to create more oppression. And so when I do de/colonizing work, I continuously question these things that we take as normal, and I begin to imagine an utopian future where there's equity, and we no longer exist in this definition of the colonizer and colonized. But currently we do. And so there is the shuttling that I was talking about that moves across these states of being: colonizing, decolonizing, hybridized form of colonizing and decolonizing, because I'm speaking here in English, and that is the language of currency. I can't speak academically in my own mother tongue because I wasn't taught to do that. I have gone to schools that taught me things in English. I will not be able to have this sophisticated discussion in my own mother tongue. So what does that do when you think in the colonizer's language and you don't have your own language to think with? And so I'll talk about language in a little bit later, but I just wanted to offer that as a framing of my understanding of decoloniality. I saw some chats pop up, so I'm going to just quickly check. Oh, I have 22 minutes left. Okay, all right. I will speed up. Okay, so some examples that I want to offer. Linda Thuya Smith traces how power is embedded explicitly and implicitly in Western discourse via its rules of classification, framing, and practice. So it benchmarks Western discourses ways of doing this and says everything has to be done in this perspective. Any effort to challenge these rules is also co-opted within Western rules of engagement for argument building. This is what um, Audrey, this is what, we call, like in the Sister Outsider book, Audrey Lorde called this the master stools cannot break the master's house, So what happens is that there's this understanding that you want to challenge us, use our tools, but those tools are not going to dismantle the master's house. So it doesn't matter how sophisticated user you become the master's tools, you're just a sophisticated colonized subject. That's all you are. And then there's in decolonial discourses, there's this conversations about knowledge epistemicide. And so Smith situates the European Enlightenment era as a source of this industrial revolution, the development of various scientific discipline, public education, arguing that imperialism contributed to these developments because they kept taking things from everywhere else, but then they repackaged it as Western thought, Western beliefs, Western philosophies. Said said that the regimes of truth in Western knowledge making often contain knowledge stolen from colonized territories, but with restricted or limited access to communities from which that theft occurred. And I did a little bit of tracing of this epistemicide to show you that. So there was Conquest, 4 types. Hall and Tendon talk about 4 types of epistemicides. For examples, conquest of Al-Andalus and the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Europe, the killing of millions of Indo-European women, mostly through burning at the stake as witches because their knowledge practices were not controlled by men, conquest of indigenous peoples of the Americas begun by the Spanish, continued by the French and English, and still underway in the early 21st century, creation of slave trade that resulted in millions of people being killed in Africa and at sea, and more being totally dehumanized by enslavement in the Americas. So just giving you like a very global sort of 4 sort of tracings. So here's a good way to see like what happens when that when we do this type of epistemicize. The Spanish burned hundreds of thousands of books in libraries in Cordoba and elsewhere, destroyed codices in Mayan, Inca, and Aztec empires, and silenced women's transmission of knowledge via oral traditions. People from Africa were considered less than human and treated with grotesque form of dehumanization through various imperialist racist ideologies. And then in current day, you can see when George Bush the Lesser attacked Iraq and then attacked all sorts of mosques and libraries and historical sites and erased centuries of resources as well. So this is something that has come out of this ladder of nature, and it situates certain non-living beings at the bottom, and then plants, and then animals, and then human. But it's not a universal Eastern thought. There are many practices and communities that existed prior to Western civilization that these sorts of hierarchical way of thinking about human and non-human relationships are not prevalent. And so when it creates this moral order of who is at the top of things and who is at the bottom of things, it also creates, who gets what. How do we care for other humans, and how do we care for our environment and resources around us as well? And I want to say that this isn't always, this wasn't always this way. There are plenty of communities and cultures that don't practice this, but now with colonialism and ways of multiple forms of erasure, a lot of us have also fallen into this moral order as well. So I'm going to move through this rather quickly to get to the later parts, but what I want to say over here, the use only our rules to challenge us, is very much a problematic notion. And Membe says that the interpretive frames make it difficult to think outside of the frames, but this is not all. This hegemonic tradition also actively represses anything that actually is articulated, thought, and envisioned from outside of these frames. So in academia, let's say you want to challenge existing structures and you want to cite folks that Western Enlightenment have not given their nod and blessing to, you're going to get a lot of gatekeeping. You're going to, if you want to come up with some innovative research methods that hasn't been blessed by Western knowledge making systems, you're going to get a lot of resistance, you know. And I really like George Day. He's a professor in Toronto. He said this proverb, which is a really beautiful proverb. It uses a Ghanaian phrase. It says, the Akan people say that if you want to know how heavy a bag of salt is, ask the one who is carrying it. So the fact that people who live the experience can be experts on their own experience is absolutely necessary to understand. But Western science would say, no, you're not being objective, because how can you be the authority of your own experience? Somebody else has to see you and put their gaze on you, and then we can talk about your experience, which is not going to be your experience. Gayatri Spivak said the subaltern cannot be heard, because of the same reason. And so I want to talk about, along with this, the erasure of language, culture, and identity that happens. And this is where Fatima talks about how, when our languages are erased and our moral values are those of the colonizers, we become proxy colonizers. We colonize our own people using the colonizers' ways. And so how do we move through this? And I would say we move through breaking rules, and as many rules you can possibly break. And for me, I don't even know which one is a colonizing rule and which one is decolonizing, because of this pervasive existence in various colonizing educational systems, that I try to break as many rules as I can, to see what happens, challenge myself, interrogate myself. And then Ramnath says that anarchy can become a force of de/colonization, because that's part of the breaking the rules, because all of these systems are so interlocked that try some anarchy and see what happens. And that you would see that colonizers would label it as anarchy so they can discipline it, especially in countries where we kicked out the colonizers from our country. So to fight against them, to fight for freedom, we had to go break rules and create a lot of anarchy for that. So the imperialistic gaze happens when you control and erase the native people's way of knowing and being. The colonizers needed to understand the native. And so this is when research became a part of creating a gaze, an ethnographic gaze, an imperialistic gaze. You do ethnographic stuff on the natives to understand them, but you're doing it to also control them. And so in the work that I do, the qualitative work, you will see primarily these are the spaces from which the work gets generated. So if it's the spaces from which the work gets generated, it's not devoid of its own history and of its own violence and settler colonialism and whiteness and other dominant forces. So we have to interrogate that. And this is where I was talking about the ethnographic data that anthropologists from Europe and global not weaponized against, folks that were not them. And I just want to sort of talk about like where my own thinking has gone within my own culture. So this was a massacre that happened in our country in India, where the British created a scenario where they asked our own people to shoot at farmers who were doing a pilgrimage during the harvest season. And so they came to visit, a sacred spot, and the General Dyer at that time created a curfew, which, folks that were farmers who were out of town didn't know. And so then he got our own people to surround the sacred spot, Jallianwala Bagh is the name of this place, and shoot at their own people. So we shot at our own people and killed them, because if we didn't, we'd be killed. these people are the soldiers who'd be killed. And there was this dry well, and people like jumped in the dry well and to their death thinking they can escape the bullet. So it was either the bullet or die by jumping, and they jumped. And Rudyard Kipling, the author of the Jungle Book, praised General Dyer for that effort. At that time in India, especially where I come from in Bengal, there was this literary author called Shukumar Rai, and he had some privilege, class privilege, and he used his printing press to create children's literature and created an enormous amount of nonsense in the literature for us to move into a liminal space where we found joy. So he created nonsense words, words that didn't have any meaning, but idiomatically we constructed meaning out of it. So the British, if they put their gaze on it, they couldn't translate it because those words didn't even exist. So what was happening was, by him creating this joy, and his stories would have hybrid characters, the benchmarking was messed up. It was literary anarchy, and so through that, he was sort of transmitting messages of fun and whimsy and critique that has now been this practice in our communities, that even folks that are removed generations from him still use these books to cultivate the same feeling of whimsy, joy. And then people like us also look for the depth of critique that you missed the first, second, third time as you were growing up. So I began to think that absurdity is absolutely a necessary way of thinking about moving towards decolonization, because normalizing oppression is absurd. The fact that we should accept that is absurd. The fact that we should become agents of it is absurd. So this escaping into a liberatory absurdity, I have sort of taken up that as one of my moves. And so this is sort of the anatomy of absurdity and qualitative research. What do you want to violate and why? Who are you in relationship to all of these things? What are you projecting? Where are you minimizing your fangs to do shadow work? So what happens is, when you take a situation and create serious amount of absurdity, what you do is you defang the situation because it's so absurd that you can't think that that's really real. But now you can talk about some real issues. You'll see that comedians do this all the time. And then having an accountability. Who are you accountable for? To whom are you speaking? Who is your audience? And imagining that as our community audience really shifts the ethics in which you present your work and you do your work and you research your work. These are some of the methodological moves that I have stated earlier that in my publications that you can do as somebody who wants to do some of this work. When you become a researcher, give up your will to know. It sounds counterintuitive, but you're not entitled to know anything. You're invited into a space and you will know what you're given. So you create a humility to move into the space. Participants and community members should be considered as primary audience way more than academic folks. Figure out who are you citing and who are you erasing, and understand that data analysis, and I can expand this more in our conversations, but data analysis is always relationship analysis. Whatever the relationship you have with the participants is what you are analyzing, because you're analyzing what came out of those relationships. And then figure out how you're going to situate new methodological strategies. So I'm going to skip over this because it's sort of similar to that. But the path ahead that I've spoken in the article that I cited is democratizing knowledge, intellectual diversity, and pluriversity to open up spaces to create Eurocentric models of inquiry and knowledge diaspora. We live in a very diasporic space. Our borders are blurring. We're always crossing borders. I'm talking to people from 3 different continents. So we have this knowledge diaspora. So if we understand that, there's no dominant flow of knowledge, we can have multi-directional knowledge flow and trace the global movement of knowledge, then we have a global way of understanding and disrupting and dismantling colonial practices and other oppressive practices as well. So what I did with all of this is I created sort of a D/colonizing communal framework to understanding the work that I want to do with my own community. And with that, I created what we call is I created a framework called per/they/see tenets. It has overlapping characteristics with multiple other communities, but I needed to curate that to create my own focus. So they/see implies folks from South Asian nation states, and so these are folks that have roots in South Asian nation states. So that would be Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and it's a contested term, just like any other term. People come in, enter the term with hesitation, interrogation, and it has plenty of that. Per/they/see in multiple South Asian language means somebody who's not from the land, not from the homeland. And then I slash it because of the here and there. We're from here and not from here. We get influenced by Western thoughts, Western civilization, Western languages. When you erase language, and I can access Shukumar Rai's work because I know the language. I know how to read and write the language. But the generation that came after me can't access that, and the generation even after that can't access it. So when you move language out of a community, you erase a lot. So what happens is, if we are thinking in English, we're communicating in English, or any other colonizer's language that erases your own language, you lose connection to your history, to your communal resources. So I didn't want to create a pure space for folks that have roots at a certain place and folks that are not rooted in those places. I wanted to keep it fluid, just like I keep the D/colonizing fluid, because there is no native colonizer, clean boundary anymore. And especially if we go with Fanon's, where observation that the colonized critiques each other and disciplines each other in the colonizer's way, that becomes very, very fluid sort of terrain. So there are six sort of tenets that I created, and this too was published by Oxford University Press, which gives me some trollish joy that it gets published there. But I wanted to talk about remembering Desh as in homeland, and remembering came out of my research, where I found that folks that are second and third generation within North America have this sort of critique of their parents' generation, that they are creating a memory of things about their homeland that they didn't even experience, and the current generation in the homeland doesn't experience it that way, but it's like a romanticized, nostalgic sort of membering of different parts together as if it's a whole, when the experience of it wasn't like that, and the existence of contemporary states of being in the homeland doesn't line up with that. So there's a remembering of that. And within our culture, we have the more desirable other, with wanting proximity to whiteness, with colorism, with whatever the dominant structure is, wanting to mitigate the harm by creating a desirability with the other would be those that is not from the homeland, those that have colonized our spaces, those that have given us our infrastructure that we use at the moment. And for those who are transnationally, diasporically located, home is permanently deferred, because you're never, as I started saying, there's a permanent shuttling, and you're never really from anywhere after you have left the homeland, because you're from here and there simultaneously. And we live and exist in beloved and problematic communities. And I put this there because I want to challenge the notion of some of the decolonial discourses that want to take us to some sort of pre-colonial utopian space. And I just don't think those things exist. I think that those things also have problematic structures of oppression, maybe not colonial, but others, like I said, Islamophobia, ableism, transphobia, and other structures of oppression. And this commodification of multiculturalism and diversity is sort of a tokenization, sort of one where, we give ourselves pats on the back because we have created certain superficial way of engaging with diversity and multiculturalism, and any kind of justice movement has to have healing as a priority. You cannot do restoration without healing, and the healing doesn't have to be just on the part of those that have been colonized. There has to be healing on the part of those that have become colonizers or descendants of colonizers as well, because we cannot continuously be in oppositional relationship to each other. We have to have bridges, and we have to create healing, and we have to be able to dream together of a future where we're no longer it's situated in oppositional relationship to each other. And with that, I have finished 2 minutes earlier than needed. And here's my question slide.